as we kind of frame scholarly questions around global learning, there's a lot more we could do to dig in beyond the rhetorical level. I think that there's wide consensus among people inside the academy as well as people outside, so parents, employers, the general public, who think it's important that students are prepared to succeed in the 21st century. And somehow they need global knowledge to do that. And I think there's a long false perception that simply if you take the student and you pick them up off of our campus and you drop them somewhere else, magically learning will happen by osmosis. And I think that's a really important question that we have to ask, is not only whether or not that learning is happening. I think there's a good scholarly base to build on. But for me, I think the most interesting question is how and why. And I think the more that we can kind of get inside of that black box and understanding why this particular educational practice has the power to transform students, for me, that's, I think, a question that drives me on a very personal level.
I think the thing that we need to understand are the aspects of the education part of global education. I think we're getting pretty good at providing students with global experiences, and we're getting pretty good at providing students with educational experiences in global contexts. But I think with any of the applied learning fields, whether that's service learning or community engagement, civic education, internships, any of those, that the education piece, the part where we sort of expressly work with the students to contextualize the things that they're learning, is an area we can do more in.
We tend to view study abroad as just a general good, and that when students go abroad, it's a good thing, it's going to open their minds, it's going to transform them in some way, and it's automatically positive. But what I have learned myself, working with students, traveling abroad with them through conferences and reading, and then also here, of course, at this seminar, is that that's just not enough. And immersion itself, just exposing students or taking them somewhere else, doesn't necessarily result in any kind of profound learning. So I think that what we need to think about looking forward, especially at my own institution, but also more broadly, is what kind of interventions can we as educators look to help better prepare our students before they go abroad so that they can interact at a less superficial level, and then also things that we can do, in my case, since I accompany my students abroad, what can I do while we're there to help them be more keen observers, to help them become more empathetic, to help them interact again, in deeper, more profound ways with local people so that they have a richer experience and so they get more out of it. And then I guess the other piece, I'm looking at sort of pre and during and post. After they've returned, what kind of follow-up activities or reflection or debriefing or other activities can we do that can help them extend their learning beyond the time that they've spent abroad? So I think all of those are essential components that all of us as international educators have to look at in more depth, to think about how it's not just enough to take students abroad or send them abroad. We have to do a whole lot more to be sure that they're fully prepared to get as much as possible out of the experience.
I think we very often assume that study abroad or off-campus programs do certain things, and we might even talk to faculty or people who are practitioners in this field and kind of get the idea what they think is happening. But I think we need to do much more research on students' attitudes, perceptions, skills, knowledge, asking the people, the learners themselves, how they see this learning, how kind of putting this meat on the bones, how does it materialize? We know it's taking place, it must, or maybe it doesn't. And we need to see how it looks like with real students.
One of the things that I am interested in is learning more about the motivation of students and why they are studying abroad, in part because at Florida International University we have a significant presence of global learning, and we have international in our name, and we want to honor the international in our name. However, our percentage of students that's studying abroad is pretty low comparatively. So how do we help students to study abroad? How do we help them understand the value of study abroad? And how do we help them realize the skills that they're going to learn when they study abroad?
How we look at off-campus study and what the priorities ought to be for future research I think is still being defined because it's such a relatively new field. I mean, people have actually been talking about it since the mid-'60s, but not acting upon it. I think both in terms of what students learn from the experience and how they process that and how they use it when they return. I also think preparing faculty to recognize that they need to do more than just give these students an experience. Experiential learning is one thing, but if you want to transform the student, then, as many of our groups are looking at, you have to provide some intervention to actually talk to the students and to get them to address issues that they're seeing, as opposed to simply sending the Instagram picture home to mom and dad. Well, they don't send it to mom and dad, do they? They send it to only their friends. So I think those issues, and quite frankly, getting faculty to recognize what these issues are. I also think, going back to the issue of global learning, I don't think faculty think in terms of global learning. And so they may have a piece of that, but I think you need to really get them to expand their definition. And so one of our projects trying to map what different disciplines understand by global learning. It's fine for a group like AAC&U at the upper levels to have a conversation and define the 5 domains, but then does it filter down to where it's actually being acted upon?
We need to take a broad look at global education, looking more holistically at not just student learning, but also faculty development and the ways in which faculty practices and behaviors and attitudes contribute to the entire enterprise. So it's a case of where you stand in the garage, we don't just become cars. By the same way, the kind of transformation and practices we expect from our students don't just happen without deliberate and careful crafting and practice. So that's one of the ways. I also think that by extension, then that helps students to think much more deliberately about how they move out of local spaces, not just simply physically getting on a plane or speaking with someone else from another country, but really thinking more expansively about how we as individuals and our actions affect global and local communities, so the global.
We're starting to understand about study abroad and other forms of off-campus learning, studying away domestically. I think we're starting to understand that student-centered learning means more than it's meant for a lot of us for the last 10 or 15 years. That shift to that is very important. I don't know that we have been accounting enough for the extent to which the way our learners are experiencing is a function of how they're framing their experiences. I think there is a strong tendency in institutions to continue to rely on external objective forms of learning, which are really important, but that it's an incomplete recognition of the holistic nature of us as human beings. Part of the human experience is profoundly our ability to frame and to experience and to create what we are in the process of creating it. And we do that individually and we do that in groups. I think we're learning this in higher education. I think there has been, if I think about recently, even 10 years ago, I think there has been a lot of suspicion about this. I think there's less suspicion today and more curiosity about it.
Higher education needs to examine more closely the intersections between study abroad and study away programs and community engagement. There's a lot of work now happening in the community engagement sector and community-based learning and research, and often those are done through community engagement offices, and then there's study abroad over here, and then there's work that's happening in the curriculum as well. And so all those are kind of separate, but they're very much related. And as higher institutions struggle with competing demands and focus and trying to make sense of how we support students that want all of these opportunities, we need to think more critically about how we connect them with each other.
Parents and people who invest money in these have to wonder if the investment financially and away from campus has payoff that's worth what it costs. And so I think there's a real practical piece that that we can't ignore. And I appreciate the work of like Dr. Neal Sobania, who has been in study abroad for years and years and years, right, and is a recognized expert, but who's challenged, saying maybe we don't have to. Maybe there are other culturally dislocating experiences or parallel experiences that could either kind of work up in a readiness model or serve as absolute legitimate experiences in their own right.
It's not always possible or feasible or realistic for students to spend part of their undergraduate education away from the home base. And I think the real challenge is, if we're committed to the outcome as global learning, international citizenship, conversant across borders and contexts, we really have to think about what we can do on our own campuses to get to the same types of goals. And it's not, again, a kind of simple osmosis magic process. We really have to think about how we structure those activities, what they mean to students, and I think what evidence we have to support our claim that our students are meeting the goals.